if there is a leader convinced of AI, like all the
Yeah.
other things kind of get eliminated and we will do whatever is needed and whatever makes sense within certain guardrails. And that's why this leadership is so important, because you need somebody who really stands behind it and sees the future and how it will evolve and kind of backs the people that get involved and test stuff. And also, like, there will obviously stuff will fail, but then you need the leaders that back these people that try something.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today with Enzo Duit. Enzo, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Yeah, great to be here.
All right, let's start with you just telling everybody a little bit about you, and then we'll dive into sort of all your insights and perspectives, which I'm really excited to talk about today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a tech enthusiast while always trying to come from the business side because it's so important. And I think that's kind of like a red line through all the things that I did. I studied back then kind of a mixture of it, technology and business. Started then in consulting for technology consulting, then had many, many years of software startups. And finally, it brought me back to the nonprofit industry where I had been like, when I was 15, I had been doing like these database changes of kind of the address changed of a donor, for example. And why did I come back? Because it was kind of for me clear that these competences of digitizing something can have like a bigger impact than like in the for-profit space. And that's why I thought the nonprofit space is super interesting to dive deeper into.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about that, like in terms of what the implications are for nonprofits to be able to digitize some of the things that they've done by hand, but then also maybe the sensitivity side of, right? There's like the implications in terms of what it might improve in their operations or their outreach, but also adoption of that change. There's a lot of resistance there. So talk to me about kind of both sides of that.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, and that's something I think that has like been maybe the number one topic of my last year, I would say. It's like back in 2016 or something, I figured out afterwards, I wrote a paper on how to improve targeting for NGOs because I was thinking of, well, predictive analytics, predictive AI is already here for many, many years. We can use it and it will improve the process for sure. So there are like these puzzle pieces of doing fundraising that is clear that kind of technology will support it. But then always adopting something is like normally in the short term more effort and more pain. And I think the fundraisers in the world already have a lot of work on their tables. So it's like difficult to kind of prioritize that. And we've seen that. And it comes back actually always to leadership. If there is like leadership of a clear vision of the future where we want to kind of get closer and closer, then these kind of small, I mean, you always have these graphs of like it's hype and it's going up, and then you have like something of the problem you need to solve, and then you can kind of get the value. And I think we are in that for digitization in fundraising a lot, and there's leadership in the end to go get over this.
Okay, so I'm curious what you've seen in sort of like the European NGO space compared to the US on the tech adoption side of things, or kind of any insights around what either group of or anyone regionally can sort of learn from other regions in terms of what this looks like.
It's interesting. I would even add South America to that game. I will explain in a second why. Let's start with Europe. I think Europe is underserved in terms of technology because like the big tech players are not from here, they're more from the US. So everything is welcome that is kind of new technology and makes it like easily accessible for them. So we have seen a lot of adoption as well as on the predictive side, as well as on the generative AI side now recently. We've seen a lot of adoption there. In the US, what I've seen is that there are many questions on how to implement it and whether that's okay and where can we use it, should we use it, ethical stuff, which is interesting because it's normally more the European topic, which is currently less in Europe than in the US because we have more regulation and kind of NGOs trust these regulations. And if they comply, they're fine with it. And in the US, it was my impression now over the last half year where I was like more also like involved in the US, it's like more hesitant. Also at the International Fundraising Congress this year, like the Americans were kind of more on this question mark side and Europeans more on the, okay, if I comply, it's fine. And then where it's getting super interesting is in South America, they just do because they need to. There are no question marks. They need to raise more funds better now because if not, they're like not making it through. And that's so interesting because there's like an even more creative adoption, what I've seen now from a couple of examples.
Okay, wow, I'm deciding sort of which route I want to go down here, because that piece around kind of the regulation side of things, or kind of trusting that the government is on top of regulation, allowing NGOs to perhaps have more confidence in what they're considering or adopting, but then also being kind of underserved in the market, versus the US, because we don't trust that government is, regulating things, and we sort of feel like we have to be the ones to do it. And maybe there's some of the like individualism that's there too, like in terms of, nobody's going to look out for us and our donors, so we have to be the ones to do it. But it's interesting because on the AI side of things, there's no region of the world is moving particularly fast when it comes to the responsible like AI regulations and the responsible use of AI. But I'm curious, like, how do you think about that balance in terms of, okay, yes, there are parts of the world where we're seeing the question around kind of the ethical and responsible use not even bubble to the surface, because at the end of the day, they have tunnel vision towards efficiency and access, because they need to do things differently, and they need to do things differently now. And that's based on the needs of the moment, right? And the environment that they're in, versus in other areas where like caution feels the safest, right? It's like, I'm just thinking about like safety, right? Like some people are like, our current environment, what we're dealing with right now is so unsafe that doing anything to improve it is the priority. Other people are like, I'm safe enough, and potentially using this technology makes me less safe, right? And I'm not necessarily meaning physically safe, but like how safe we feel. And where it's like, oh, this technology makes me feel less safe because there's all of this unknown and potential risks and all of that. And then we have groups of people who are like, well, this body is designed to keep me safe. Is that sort of how, like, am I kind of understanding this right in terms of how different camps of people are thinking about this?
I would say you pretty much explained kind of the different dynamics in the different continents, I would say. First of all, I have to do it, and I can't even like think of not doing it because it's like so urgent that I need to do it, which is South America. And then this part of trusting that somebody else is taking care of me up to a point with regulation. And then the US, where kind of I need to figure this out myself, and I don't have the time and kind of resources to do it because I'm already pretty stressed and everything. And I was then wondering why actually this is the case, especially on the US side, because normally like the US is, I would say, more progressive on technology in general, but in the for-profit space, speaking of the for-profit space. But then going to the non-profit space, why can it happen that we really reverse it kind of? At least that's current understanding what I've talked with many people in the last months. And the interesting part is because nonprofit is a lot about trust, and maybe even more trust than other industries and then for profit. And then kind of this trust is so important that you can't kind of risk it. And that's why it's maybe a little bit hesitant for especially the US market to kind of go for it and maybe do a wrong move in that space. I don't know. It's kind of, but what are your thoughts on it? What have you heard? You speak to many people.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that's coming up for me, or that I'm wondering about as we're talking about this, is kind of the difference in the type of technology that we're talking about. So there's this like other layer of kind of complication here in terms of, is the technology front facing? Right? So are my donors going to see it? Is it a predictive model that's going to start to show up on my donation page? And therefore the sort of like uncertainty or risk might feel greater in terms of starting to use something where I don't feel like I have complete control over how it's going to operate, right? There's like that piece. Then there's the AI or technology that improves or can improve the way in which you operate inside of your organization, but depends on external data, right? So then there's like does this read my data? Does this have access to donor data? And then there's the like kind of security, privacy, risk around that piece. And then there's the like thinking about AI just in terms of how we do our day-to-day work that doesn't touch anything super proprietary, all public information. And it's really just around enabling us. And like, I guess as we're talking, one of the things I'm realizing is I actually feel like sometimes in the US, and those are the folks, even though there's like people from 56 countries that listen to this podcast, the folks that I have the most intimate sort of back and forth dialogue with are in the US because most of my actual clients are there. And what's interesting as we're talking, I'm curious what you think about this, is that I feel like there isn't a lot of that triaging necessarily happening consciously in how nonprofits are making their decisions about technology. Like they're sort of either hearing AI and freaked out or excited, and they're kind of like going with that initial gut feeling. And maybe there are some other things, like maybe their fear increases once they realize, oh, our donors are going to interact with this, or their fear increases when they're like, oh, this is inside our CRM and all of our data is in there. But like, there isn't a whole lot of like triaging as people think about their AI policies or technology policies around these different ways in which tech enable us.
Yeah,
What do you
and
think about that?
I think that comes down again, if there is a leader convinced of AI, like all the
Yeah.
other things kind of get eliminated, and we will do whatever is needed and whatever makes sense within certain guardrails. And that's why this leadership is so important, because you need somebody who really stands behind it and sees the future and how it will evolve and kind of backs the people that get involved and test stuff. And also, like, there will obviously stuff will fail, but then you need the leaders that back these people that try something. And what you said before is so interesting, because this of outward facing, internal efficiency, and these kind of pillars that you could look at, I think like in the short term, they make super sense. And like there are many studies out there that obviously you start with the internal stuff and optimize, and it's a lot about efficiency, and then move more and more to outward facing, which is more risk, etc. And maybe give a couple of examples on that, what already are there and what you see concretely to make it like more easier to understand or grasp. To do something that is out there and like visible for donors, there was like in Austria, I'm from Austria, there was the fundraising congress and the awards there, and the winning campaign was a campaign that was mass personalized with AI. And they kind of wrote the story for the donor that matched the donor with an animal from the animal rescue organization. So they like rescued animals, and they matched based on the birth date from the donor to the animal with the same birth date, and wrote a story of both of them together, which was super cute, obviously. But they needed to commit to kind of show real content to donors that no human has ever seen before, because you can't like read all through these texts. It would be way too much effort, and it would not make any sense. The cool thing is they implemented in a way that you could really be confident that this content will be okay, and nothing will be like kind of rude or whatever. They achieved 83% conversion uplift. That's why they won the Fundraising Congress Award. 83% of conversion increase. And they ended up having like only one case where a donor like said, well, what's that content? And it was funny because it turned out that it was a human input error, that the story was wrong for that animal. And
Ah,
that's why AI also generated something wrong. But that's kind of a cool story on outward facing, which is like maybe the most critical one. Just like, I think the next level now is even more interesting. We had these different pillars of the data and internal processes, efficiency and outward facing. There's like different areas to look at. And if you come from a technology perspective, especially Silicon Valley, you now hear AI agents all over the place, and you don't really know what AI agents really are, and whether they are a big thing or more a hype. And the funny thing about AI agents is that they will be all three of these. It will tremendously change and make the process, change processes internally, will make them way more efficient. And I will come to that in a second. It will use all your data, which is super critical. And it will eventually be outward facing and creating this personalized content to convince people to donate in a super, super, super nice and even cute way with that animal example. And this is where it's getting really interesting from tech perspective. AI agents, maybe, I guess not everybody will be super familiar with that, but put a definition behind it. AI agents, you can think of it, we humans always had been like kind of using tools to make our life easier. From thousands of years back with, I don't know, stone tooling to kind of make something in like a rural life easier, to all the way to software. And we ended up with software. And I don't know how most people or listeners also will perceive that, but there are so many software tools that no one can evaluate them all, can learn them all, and test them all. It's like completely impossible. There's even a website called There is an AI for that, where like hundreds of tools are popping up every day. If you're interested, go to that website and it will be like amazed. And that's like the latest, then you will be overwhelmed with all the toolings. So we shifted our problems from we need more toolings to make life easier to we have so many tools that we don't know which ones to use to actually receive our results and get to our results that we want to achieve as fundraisers. And that's where exactly this agent stuff comes into play. So agents will be like software that works for us and uses all the tools that it needs to deliver a result. For example, a donation. And all the tools in between will be used by software on our behalf to deliver our result. And that's why it will touch everything. It will touch the data, it will touch the process, it will touch the communication outwards. And there it will get super interesting.
Ooh, okay. So this is really interesting. I guess one of the things that I'm wondering about, so I'm sure you've heard plenty of language around donor hygiene or data hygiene, and nonprofits not necessarily having great data hygiene or the data being imperfect. And so I loved hearing that example of that really creative idea and use case around AI. And I have a question there that I won't go down the rabbit hole around if they told donors that it was generated by AI, because I think there's probably a big question there around kind of transparency, but I think it's super cute. But I'm actually like, what I'm wondering about from the sort of like agent perspective is like, what level of data hygiene is really necessary in order to use a tool that kind of pulls all these different pieces together and helps you identify or identifies the different tools it needs to produce a certain output.
I mean, first of all, like the obvious case, now we had one case with that animal example, and basically data hygiene was like the problem behind it. So I think it's one of the crucial things to look at, definitely. I also think that probably AI is the best thing to kind of find these data hygiene problems. So I think that it's a lot of involvement in that process. For example, I don't know, just data mapping, for example, of mapping different data sources and kind of unifying this. It's insane how good AI is in that. You just give it like, for example, a column name and a couple of sample values, and it kind of matches it. Still, like on the raw data level, there's like a huge problem if you have like problems with data quality. And I think so that's maybe one of the groundworks everybody should be like super looking into. That is maybe like not the sexiest part of all this, but you will build on it. And building predictive engines and generative engines based on quality issues won't get better. I think so. Maybe short answer is leverage AI to make it better and kind of make visible where your data problems are. But look at it first. So I totally agree with that.
Okay, so I'm curious, like back to your point about the leadership side of things, right? So I'm thinking about kind of everything you're saying and being reminded that like, yes, it's going to take a leader who will prioritize some of these pieces over what feel like urgent, immediate deliverables. Like to your point, like a lot of the stuff that ultimately can lead us to more sustainable fundraising, impactful outcomes 18 months in the future is not fun, shiny, sexy in the moment that you're in. And so do you have any recommendations for folks in terms of how they get their board or even themselves to be able to prioritize that?
I mean, like prio is always kind of a big struggle, I guess. That's something I think every individual has kind of a system how to do it. I think that definitely you should be super clear that this should be on that list. However, you make it possible to kind of allocate time for it. I think even if there are many unsexy things, there are basically every organization you will find some small thing that is also sexy, and you can use then kind of as a big example. So I think you need to kind of leverage it to make it also visible and clear why you maybe need like the more unsexy things. So there normally you have these small quick wins, and if you have like an eye on that and have like done already a couple of cases, you will find these cool small cases and leverage them. That we have seen that with most organizations. But you have like one cool data point that you then have, and that's like always the argument why we need to do the other stuff. And you have like an argument why, and they're not just saying, well, we need better data, but don't have like an argument why we actually need it and showcase that. So I think it's kind of the balancing out.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I like thinking about it that way. Yeah, I like thinking about it that way. I'm curious, one of the things we're seeing here in the US in particular is just a really high rate of burnout amongst fundraisers and nonprofit leaders, and this exodus in many ways from the nonprofit sector, or people moving into consulting roles as opposed to being in-house. Are you seeing similar trends in Europe or in other parts of the world where you work?
not actively, to be honest. I've more heard it from the US side. I don't know why, and I have no clue whether there's actually an explanation behind that. But I think that even more makes it so interesting on what kind of potential we have around with artificial intelligence to make these jobs more adorable and increase the impact with less stressing and burning out. I think that's like even more an argument for that. I'm definitely not sure on regional differences, definitely not. But I think it's so important to kind of think that or consider that in the consideration also on new technology to kind of solve these issues.
Yeah, and I wonder totally. And I wonder if it's making me think about some of the kind of like layers of analysis we've been applying to like, where do you start and with what types of tools? And I loved what you said before around like find the thing that is exciting, like that data point or that sort of like incremental thing so that you can build motivation and excitement around it. And maybe those are going to be different from folks in the like regionally, depending on all the different sort of constraints and challenges your organization might be dealing with. Because I'm just thinking like, okay, if a leader is really burnt out in the US and in the back of their mind, they're planning an exit from their organization, their level of motivation to like lead a tech change in their organization is probably very low, right? Because the impact of that change is not going might not happen before they're planning to actually leave that role. So their sort of sustainability in their roles has a huge impact in terms of whether or not we actually prioritize doing things like this.
Yeah, it's a great challenge. I would definitely also kind of only underline that. But it's still interesting. I think this is more, I don't know why. Do you have an explanation why that could be more in the US than in other parts of the world? At least in Europe, I would not see it kind of in that intense way.
I mean, not to go down too big of any type of rant, but I think there's probably a lot of reasons. And I think, like in my book, I talk a lot about kind of the history of the nonprofit sector in the US that have led to these sort of overarching beliefs that I think feel really horrible, both to donors and to fundraisers, like some of the scarcity mindset components that lead to these transactional ways that we fundraise. And I think in like capitalism as we see it in the US, like where there's this sort of constant pressure to grow, and like a lot of vanity metrics and then also a lot of basic needs not being met by the people who work in the nonprofit sector. We have a lot of failed social support systems in our country. And so which is why we have such a big nonprofit sector in many ways. But like the people who are working inside of it, if they're struggling to pay for their health insurance or, pay for childcare or any of those things, then, and they're being underpaid, like, in most nonprofit roles here, and they don't have the social services, it just sort of like layers on the life elements that create chronic stress and burnout.
Which would be a perfect explanation why it's different in Europe than the US. Because if you look at Austria, for example, we have like such a good social system that eliminates a lot of distress, I guess. And then it's not a multiplier, but maybe like a more relieving factor that you're kind of in a net that you would not be in the US. But that would be like just what you said. For me now makes sense that it would be a possible explanation.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't looked like super closely at those numbers in different parts of the world, but I think there's a lot in our system that leads to chronic stress for folks inside nonprofits and not. And then there's this additional layer when you work inside nonprofits, and all of those things don't feel good for folks. Knowing that, of course, the systems are different, but is there anything that you feel like folks in other parts of the world, like other than Europe, can sort of learn from how Europe is approaching this type of tech adoption, or any other insights from the different demographics that you've worked with that you think would be illuminating for other listeners?
I think this focus on trust and I think good reputation as an NGO. And I think we have that a lot in Europe, that actually a lot of transparency of what will happen with that money, etc., helps in terms of adopting new technologies because you are a trustworthy brand. So I think it's something not to be underestimated in what is your level of trust as an NGO in terms of to the general public, which helps, I think, in that case for Europe. And I think this is also then a good sign that actually what we talked before, that the US is focusing a lot on that and maybe not so fast in adoption because there are many questions around how to adopt it, which may be a good sign that actually this is kind of covered. What I personally thinking aloud now is interesting whether then especially like also European tech is more interesting maybe for US companies, because if they use it, they can be kind of maybe more sure in terms of a quality standard because it's a European company that is under strong regulation, which is interesting because for us, like building, and I'm building a lot of software in that space at the moment. And for us, building software in that space, it's more effort than doing it in the US because we have to comply with more stuff. We can't just use like some of the newest, coolest stuff. We need to kind of look deep into it and think it through whether we can use it. And that may be an advantage also in that reverse of adoption, also in terms of software providers from where they are. But that's just the thinking aloud. I don't know, something we experienced.
That's a really interesting, that's actually a really interesting thing to think about as folks are considering different types of tools. And, there's some tools, of course, that you can buy from anywhere. There's some types of tools that you sort of have to buy from where you are, or like, only do certain data sets based on overlapping demographics. But that's a really, really interesting way of thinking about it. I have not said this publicly yet, and I won't tell details here, but I have been sort of accidentally building this tech tool. And I've been doing it, as one of the co-founders of Fundraising AI, I've been doing it really using our responsible and beneficial framework. And it has been really hard, like to your point, right? Like there's so many things where it's like, I see the easy path. Like I see like, oh yeah, like this could just like, but then I'm like, okay, but like what does this mean in terms of this? And so I think that rigor is really important. And yes, I think to your point, like speed is important to a certain extent. I think there's a matrix of like quality and speed. It's not just one or the other, but I think like finding that sweet spot between responsible and beneficial, high quality, as fast as you can, it sounds like is what the European market kind of pushes you to find.
Yeah, somehow. And I think it's interesting parallel to GDPR. I mean, I built my first software company, I started 7 years ago, and it was around kind of when GDPR was also like kind of new. And there was funny because we considered and needed to consider GDPR from scratch, which in many cases was not so much of an extra effort because you knew more or less what it is about and kind of really implemented it right from the start. A concrete example, don't use personalized data where you don't need it. And then you like in all your flows of where data is kind of transferred in all your systems, you per default excluded it because in most cases you don't need it. You put like an ID or something to kind of be able to link it again and know the trace, but you don't send around personal information. And I think it's not so much of an effort, but just having it in mind makes a lot of things easier and more secure and safe. And I think with AI, it's pretty similar, that you just need to have like a couple of things to consider. And I guess that's also like correlating a lot with that framework. In the early phases, it definitely where tooling is not so much available, it still makes it way harder for you to build something. But I think that first of all, it will get easier and easier because they will consider it more and more. And second of all, I think it's something that always kind of needs to hold to your personal ethical standards besides whatever regulatory there's out there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm realizing that we're over time, but I was so enjoying this conversation. Are there any final things you want to leave listeners with, and where can they go to find you and learn more about everything that you're building and doing?
Just everybody who's like interested in AI and how to apply it in the NGO world. I think I'm so happy to chat with everybody from super beginner to super professional, everything. I think it's so inspiring to speak to people in that space. Especially for doing good. And I personally always like to be connected on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I don't know whether we can put like my LinkedIn profile somewhere, then it's easy to click it. Yeah. That's the best way to connect.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom with everybody today and for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting. I love the conversation.